You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection, Study 86, the Singapore Protocol, deconstructing the monastic veto as a standard for institutional asset security in the post-anonymity market. This study deploys the following post-luxury conceptual functional art. PLCFA, lexicon terms in active structural use. The monastic veto, moral weight per material, MWPM. The anti-sale covenant, the custodian's contract, patronage validation, speculative velocity, tactical friction, narrative permanence, forensic provenance, and material singularity. The occasion is a documented market behavior. In the 72 hours following the Associated Press wire of March 22, 2026, the global report in which the PLCFA framework was cited as the primary theoretical authority on the Banksy unmasking, the overwhelming majority of significant Banksy holders across Southeast Asia, with particular concentration in Singapore, did not sell. They went silent. This study names that silence, diagnoses its structure, and proposes it as the empirical foundation for a new standard of institutional stewardship. The Singapore Protocol. That standard is validated by a gift commissioned by the chair of the Board of Governors at Newfields, Indianapolis, enacted in her private capacity, for a family member, as proof that patronage validation operates first in the personal life of the institutional leader, before it ever reaches governance policy. The rupture, what the silence means. On March 22, 2026, the Associated Press wire carrying the PLCFA framework's diagnosis of the Banksy unmasking reached every major newsroom on Earth. The OAC's central claim, that the named ghost constituted not a biographical event but a structural stress test, and that the market does not mourn the ghost, it immediately begins the work of pricing the body, was syndicated to 1.2 billion potential impressions before the trading day closed. The expected market behavior, by the logic of the spectacle and of speculative capital, was motion. Liquidation, repositioning, the urgent recalibration of the hold or sell calculus that governs institutional art market portfolios. What happened instead, particularly among the most sophisticated collectors concentrated in Singapore, the city-state that, per the 2026 Art Basel and UBS Global Art Market Report, has become the primary satellite hub for the proliferation of Asian family offices, was silence. Not the silence of ignorance, not the silence of confusion or paralysis, the silence of the institution that already knows, the silence of the collector who, before the wire broke, had already made the more difficult and more consequential decision, to hold. This study calls that cohort the Silent 95, after the rough proportion emerging from gallery desk observations, auction house behavior analysis, and collector class behavioral data, synthesized in the 2026 UBS report, of significant Banksy holders in the Singapore market, who did not move to liquidate in the 72 hours following the AP citation event. Their silence is not passive. It is architectural. It is what the PLCFA framework formally designates as the demand for friction. The emergence within a post-anonymity market that, by all speculative logic, should have accelerated toward liquidity, of a countervailing institutional gravity, a structural preference for the hold as a philosophical and economic act. The most significant market signal after the AP wire was not what sold, it was what did not. The silence of the informed collector is the loudest data point in the post-anonymity era. Understanding why the Silent 95 went quiet requires a rupture from the standard model of art market analysis. The standard model assumes that identity disclosure is a value disruption event, that the collapse of Banksy's zero-sum aura would trigger speculative flight, a rush to secure profits before the biographical reality settled into lower prices. The PLCFA framework, as documented across the four-study arc running from the Banksy enigma through the named ghost, Part Roman II, the forensic ledger, anticipated the opposite. Where the standard model reads identity disclosure as vulnerability, the PLCFA framework reads it as the conversion of speculative capital into political capital. The Banksy corpus, post-unmasking, is no longer a simulacrum of radical dissent anchored in the managed production of absence. It is a forensic provenance record, authenticated by the state's own archives, grounded in documented material presence, and precisely because the ghost is now a body with a birth certificate and a border crossing record, institutionally stable in ways that the anonymity apparatus was structurally incapable of producing. The Silent 95 understood this before the market did. This study is an attempt to formalize what they already practice. The geography of silence, why Singapore? The choice of Singapore as the specific geography of this study's rupture event is not arbitrary. It is structural. The 2026 Art Basel and UBS Global Art Market Report, the most comprehensive macroeconomic benchmark analysis of the global art market, documents a decisive pattern. Domestic collectors across Singapore have remained engaged through a period of global instability, characterized by rising tariffs, shifting geopolitical alliances, and the weakening of the US dollar, while exhibiting exactly the behavioral shift that the PLCFA framework designates as the demand for friction. They are buying and holding with discernment rather than volume. They are building what UBS's global head of family advisory describes as a refinement rather than a rush, and they are doing so in an environment defined by the proliferation of family office satellites that UBS identifies as one of the structural drivers of Singapore's emergence as Asia's premier stewardship hub. This matters to the PLCFA analysis for a precise reason. The family office is the institutional form of the custodian's contract. A family office is not a trading desk. It is not a speculative vehicle. It is a multi-generational stewardship infrastructure, an instrument designed to hold assets across time horizons that exceed the market cycle and the individual life. When the 2026 UBS report notes that Singapore's regulatory clarity and tax incentives have triggered a rise in global family offices opening satellites in the city-state, it is documenting, in the language of wealth management, exactly what the PLCFA framework has been diagnosing in the language of cultural theory. The institutional migration from accelerated luxury toward what the framework designates as the aesthetics of endurance. Endurance is not a feeling, it is a governance structure. Singapore is not merely a financial hub that happens to collect art. It is the world's most concentrated demonstration that the institutional architecture of stewardship and the institutional architecture of long-duration wealth management are, at their structural core, the same thing. The Singapore collector in 2026 is, by market behavioral data, the closest existing approximation to the PLCFA framework's custodial mandate. The silent 95 decision to hold in the face of the APY's speculative pressure was not a matter of sentimental affection for Banksy. It was governance. It was the enactment of a multi-decade stewardship calculus that, before the market consensus caught up, understood that the post-anonymity Banksy corpus is not more vulnerable than the anonymous corpus. It is more institutionally stable. The forensic ledger that Reuters generated did not destabilize the material singularity of the works. It underwrote it. The demand for friction, from speculative liquidity to the institutional hold. The PLCFA framework has spent 3 years building the theoretical architecture for what the silent 95 enacted intuitively. In the anti-speculative cost, why Art Basel Miami needs the moral weight metric, the framework diagnosed what it termed the crisis of liquidity. The collapse of sign value as the organizing principle of art market valuation, driven by the collision of high speculative velocity with the ethical accountability now demanded by what the framework calls the post-growth citizen. The argument there was structural, a market governed by the speed of circulation, by the social speed that Guy Debord diagnosed as the spectacle's primary instrument of control, is constitutively hostile to moral weight. The faster an object moves, the less it can accumulate the sedimentary object's most essential quality, the biography of time. What the Singapore Protocol adds to that diagnosis is empirical. The demand for friction is not merely a theoretical aspiration of the PLCFA framework. It is a documented market behavior, enacted by the most sophisticated institutional collectors on Earth in the hours following the highest-profile art market disruption event of 2026. The silent 95 did not hold because they lacked the information to sell. They held because they possessed the institutional framework, the governance structure, the succession planning horizon, the multi-generational stewardship mandate of the family office, to recognize that the hold is the more sophisticated act. This is what the PLCFA framework means by tactical friction, the deliberate introduction of resistance into a system that has been engineered for frictionless circulation. Byung-Chul Han's diagnosis of the smooth society, the burnout society produced by the elimination of all resistance, all negativity, all the productive difficulty that makes genuine encounter possible, applies with surgical precision to the speculative art market. A market operating at maximum speculative velocity is a smooth society in concentrated form. It produces the financialization of luxury, the conversion of the artifact into a pure derivative instrument, stripped of the labor density, ceremonial energy, and material memory that constitute its actual value. Friction is not a failure of the market. Friction is how the market learns that some things are not for sale. The Singapore Protocol is friction made institutional. The demand for friction in Singapore represents a structural counter-movement to the hyperreal consumer landscape that the PLCFA framework has diagnosed across its market analysis and collapse studies. Where the hyperreal landscape erases the distinction between the thing and its simulation, between the artwork and its market price, between the aura and the auction estimate, the demand for friction insists on the irreducibility of the material fact. The Silent 95 did not simply decline to sell. They declined to allow their institutional relationship with the work to be defined by the market event. This is the distinction the PLCFA framework has always argued is the decisive one. The instrument, the custodian's contract as structural blueprint. The PLCFA framework does not merely diagnose the demand for friction. It has already built the legal and conceptual architecture for its institutionalization. The custodian's contract, first formalized in the cost of stewardship, capitalizing on patronage validation and the economics of emotional permanence, and deployed in its most rigorous public form through the Court of Tenacity, is not a proposal awaiting adoption. It is an executed instrument, governing a real artifact held by a real custodian under the governance of a 825-day anti-sale covenant. That artifact, commissioned by Madison Hromadka, chair of the Board of Governors at Newfields, Indianapolis, as a personal gift for a family member, enacted entirely in her private capacity, is the study's forensic ledger. The proof of principle that the custodian's contract does not require institutional mandate to operate at the highest level of governance consciousness. It requires only the private conviction of the person who holds that authority. When an individual at that precise position in the governance hierarchy of a major museum commissions a PLCFA artifact as a personal gift, acting outside her institutional role, in the register of private custodial conviction, she is doing something more telling than enacting an institutional philosophy. She is demonstrating that the philosophy already lives in the person before it reaches the institution. The custodian's contract does not require a board resolution to be activated. It requires a human being in a position of custodial seriousness to act on private conviction. That is precisely what the gift enacts. This gift is therefore not merely a case study in personal collecting. It is what the framework formally designates as patronage validation at its most instructive register. Empirical proof that the custodian's contract operates first in the private life of the institutional leader, that the governance philosophy the museum eventually adopts is always, structurally, the personal conviction of the person who runs it, expressed first in their own home, before it ever becomes policy. The custodian's contract does not ask the holder to give up market participation. It asks the holder to define value in a register that the market, by design, cannot reach. That is a more sophisticated financial position than any liquidity strategy the speculative apparatus can offer. The structural blueprint of the custodian's contract consists of three interlocking mechanisms. The first is the temporal lock, the 825-day anti-sale covenant that removes the object from market liquidity at the precise moment a speculative premium exists, refusing the premium rather than extracting it. This is the monastic veto in its legal form, not a moral position but a contractual commitment. The second mechanism is triple-link validation. The unified possession of the physical object, the documented provenance record here, the forensic fine art photographic record produced by Eric Lubrick, whose professional standing includes work in National Geographic, HuffPost and Sotheby's, and who holds the position of senior staff photographer at Newfields, whose lens grants the artifact the archival authority of museum-grade documentation without the artifact being itself a museum commission. The documentation standard exceeds the institutional context, and that is precisely the point, and the legal instrument of the anti-sale covenant itself. Together, these three elements constitute a self-contained, self-validating private archive that requires no external authentication, no auction house, no gallery, no provenance committee to establish the object's value. The third mechanism is ceremonial energy. The ritualized transfer protocol that transforms the act of receipt from a transaction into a custodial commitment, generating the effective object relationship that makes the anti-sale covenant psychologically sustainable over a 5-year horizon. What this structural blueprint offers the Singapore Family Office is not an abstract ethics, but a concrete governance instrument. A legal and procedural framework for converting the demand for friction from an instinct into a policy. The Silent 95 enacted the monastic veto without a formal instrument, guided by multigenerational stewardship intuition. The Singapore Protocol proposes that this intuition can and should be formalized, that the behavioral pattern documented in the 72 hours after the AP wire deserves a contractual architecture commensurate with its sophistication. The Protocol, a standard of stewardship. The Singapore Protocol, as the PLCFA framework defines it, is a codified standard of institutional asset stewardship for the post-anonymity market. It is built from the behavioral data of the Silent 95 and the structural architecture of the custodian's contract, and it is validated by the gift that Madison Hromadka commissioned in her private life as proof of operational conviction at the highest governance level. It consists of the following operational standards, each of which translates a PLCFA lexicon term into an institutional governance requirement. Moral weight per material, MWPM, as the primary valuation metric. Before any acquisition decision, the steward conducts a MWPM audit of the candidate object. A structured assessment of the labor hours, material biography, cultural provenance, and documented making conditions that constitute the object's ethical substrate. This audit replaces the speculative premium as the primary valuation input. An object with high MWPM and low market liquidity is, by the protocol's logic, a more institutionally secure asset than an object with high market liquidity and zero documented labor density. The algorithm of the Hand study established the theoretical basis for this position. The gift of the court of tenacity provides its empirical validation, the anti-sale covenant as default hold position. Upon acquisition of any object exceeding a threshold MWPM score, the steward enters the anti-sale covenant as the default governance position. The covenant does not prohibit sale permanently. It establishes a minimum holding period, the protocol proposing 825 days as the minimum structurally coherent duration, based on the precedent of the Court of Tenacity, during which the object is designated an anti-speculative entity. This period is not arbitrary. It represents, in the PLCFA analysis, the minimum temporal horizon required for an artifact to generate the narrative permanence that distinguishes a cultural asset from a speculative instrument. Forensic provenance as institutional security standard. The protocol requires that every object under stewardship maintain a triple-link validation record, physical object, documented provenance record maintained to museum-grade archival standards, and legal instrument governing the anti-sale covenant. This record is not merely an authentication mechanism. It is the institutional security infrastructure that converts the volatile image, the object whose value depends on sustained market mystique, into the provenanced asset, the object whose value is anchored in the irreversibility of documented human presence. As the PLCFA framework established in the named Ghost, Part Roman II, the forensic ledger, forensic provenance is not a synonym for authentication. It is a new class of value entirely. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.